The exhaust manifold of the '67 Mustang was cracked, leaking a sharp, metallic smell of unburned hydrocarbons directly into the lower bay. I slid out from under the chassis on the low-profile wooden creeper, the heavy steel casters rolling smoothly over the grease-stained concrete. I wiped a thick streak of black sludge from my jaw with a heavy canvas rag, staring up at the exposed undercarriage of the classic muscle car. The cast-iron block was retaining heat, radiating a dry warmth against the chill of the uninsulated warehouse. The industrial co-working complex was loud, an echoing cavern of sound built from the rhythmic pulse of pneumatic drills, the high-pitched whine of heavy air compressors, and the occasional sharp clang of dropped carbon steel. To anyone else, it was a chaotic headache. To me, it was the only place I actually wanted to breathe. The grit, the oil, and the noise here were real. Everything else in my life, the 8-figure trust fund, the mandated board seats at Young Holdings that I perpetually ignored, the endless family expectations was just paper. Paper didn't require precisely 90 foot-pounds of torque. Paper didn't bleed transmission fluid when a cork gasket finally blew. Out there, in the sterile, climate-controlled corporate towers my father owned, I was treated as a primary financial asset. In Bay 7 of this drafty garage, I was just a mechanic with calloused hands, a frayed apron, and an overpriced set of snap-on wrenches. I sat up, tossing the soiled rag onto my heavily scarred wooden workbench. I picked up a 3/8 drive ratchet, preparing to drop the transmission pan. That was when I heard the sharp, frantic sound of a staple gun firing rapidly in the adjacent bay. The rhythm was entirely wrong. It wasn't the steady, measured, thwack-pause-thwack of professional auto upholstery work. It was an erratic, punishing staccato. It sounded like someone trying to force a machine to do something it wasn't designed to do. I set my ratchet down on the metal tray. I walked over to the chain-link partition that separated my workspace from Bay 4. Harper Jones was leaning over her heavy industrial sewing table, wrestling a thick, stubborn piece of distressed oxblood leather over a bucket seat frame. She was 35, wearing faded denim overalls covered in faint traces of adhesive and dye, a gray t-shirt, and heavy, steel-toed work boots. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy knot that looked like it had been pulled tight in frustration at least 3 times that morning. She was the best independent auto upholstery specialist in the district. Usually, her movements were a masterclass in economy and precision. She knew exactly how fabrics yielded to tension. Today, she was working with a frantic, desperate energy that practically vibrated across the wire fence. She misfired the pneumatic staple gun. The heavy metal staple ricocheted off the inner steel tubing of the seat frame, bypassing the high-density foam and burying itself deeply into the solid oak leg of the table. Mere inches from her knee, Harper flinched, dropping the heavy gun onto the concrete floor. The air hose hissed slightly where it hit the ground. Her knuckles were stark white. She didn't swear. She didn't kick the table. She just stared at the ruined edge of the leather panel, her chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic bursts. I walked around the end of the chain-link partition, stepping into her bay. I didn't announce myself. I simply picked up a heavy flathead screwdriver from the top tray of her rolling tool cart. I walked over to the table, wedged the flat tip precisely under the misfired staple, and applied steady downward pressure. I pried the thick wire out of the wood in one smooth, practiced motion, setting the bent metal on the table. "You're rushing," I said. I kept my voice casual, understated, refusing to add any dramatic weight to the failure. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes locked on the puncture mark in the fabric. "I have to finish this full interior set by tomorrow morning. The client is paying a massive premium for the rush. I don't have time to do it slowly, Bentley." "The leather is cold," I observed, pointing the end of the screwdriver at the stiff, unyielding material. "It's not stretching over the foam bolsters. If you force the tension with the gun right now, you'll tear the seams at the baseline the second someone actually sits on it. You know the material limits better than anyone in this building." "What's the rush?" She finally turned her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed, carrying a profound exhaustion that seemed to settle deep into her bones. She walked over to her small, cluttered metal desk, picked up a crisp, heavy-stock white envelope, and tossed it toward me. It landed face-up on the distressed leather seat. "Vincent dropped it off an hour ago," she said, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. I didn't need to open the envelope to understand the threat. The bold red stamp across the front of the windowed paper was entirely clear. Notice to vacate. Vincent Perez owned the master lease for this entire industrial complex. He was a mid-tier commercial landlord who specialized in a very specific, predatory tactic. He bought distressed industrial properties, manufactured minor structural violations, raised the operational fines to unpayable levels, and forced independent fabricators out. Once the bays were clear, he brought in high-paying corporate logistics companies who needed warehouse space near the interstate. 30 days? I asked, my voice remaining entirely level, treating the disaster like a broken fuel pump. 14, Harper corrected, her jaw tightening so hard a muscle jumped in her cheek. He activated the hazardous materials clause in the commercial lease. He claims the aerosol adhesive fumes from my bay are an environmental violation. It's a complete lie. My overhead ventilation system is entirely to code. I clean the micron filters every Friday. But he wants the space for a new freight tenant by the end of the month, and the contractual fine for an environmental breach is $10,000. If I don't pay the fine and the newly inflated back rent by the 14th, the lease states he seizes my physical equipment to cover the debt. I looked around her bay. I looked at the heavy industrial walking-foot sewing machines, the massive racks of rare imported fabrics, the specialized cutting tables, and the tools she had spent 10 grueling years acquiring. It wasn't just a business for her. It was her entire identity. She had built it from nothing, fighting every bank loan officer who told her an independent shop was a bad risk. I have to take every single rush job I can physically get my hands on, she said, turning back to the table and reaching for the fallen staple gun. I need the cash. I am unbankable right now. So, I don't have time to let the leather warm up to room temperature, Bentley. I just have to force it and hope the seams hold. I stepped forward. I reached out and gently pushed the barrel of the staple gun down, forcing the metal nozzle to rest firmly against the wooden table. I kept my hand resting on the top of the tool, ensuring the air compressor line remained pinched off. You can't pay a $10,000 fine with rush upholstery jobs in 2 weeks, I said, stating the absolute mathematical reality. You'll ruin your hands, you'll ruin the work, and you'll destroy your reputation in the classic car community before the eviction even hits. I don't have another option, she snapped, her grip on the handle tightening as she tried to pull the gun away. I didn't let go of the tool, but I didn't grip it aggressively either. I just held the weight steady, offering physical resistance to her panic. Yes, you do. I let go of the gun, walked past her, and pulled a heavy, variable temperature industrial heat gun from the metal rack behind her workstation. I unspooled the thick yellow cord, plugged it into the wall outlet, and handed the heavy plastic handle to her. You heat the leather. You do the job exactly the way you know it needs to be done. I'll read the lease. She stared at the heat gun in her hand, then looked at me, a deep frown creasing her forehead. You're a mechanic, Bentley. You rebuild carburetors and swap transmissions. You aren't a corporate lawyer. I know how to read. I deflected smoothly, leaning back against the edge of her desk and picking up the white envelope. Warm the leather. Harper. She hesitated. The defensive wall was high, built from years of fighting predatory vendors and dismissing fake charity. But the sheer practical logic of the heat gun won out. She clicked the switch on. The low, rushing hum of the internal fan filled the bay as she began to sweep the hot air steadily over the stiff oxblood material. The leather instantly began to relax, the natural oils reacting to the temperature. I pulled the dense legal document from the envelope and began to read the fine print. I spent my entire childhood surrounded by ruthless asset managers, corporate attorneys, and board members who spoke entirely in loopholes. I recognized the structure of Vincent's trap immediately. He had buried a secondary clause on page 12 that allowed immediate seizure of assets for perceived environmental violations, deliberately bypassing the standard 30-day commercial arbitration period. It was highly predatory, but it was legally binding unless actively contested with a certified structural audit from an outside firm. He's citing Section 4B, I said, dropping the heavy document back onto her cluttered desk. It requires a certified environmental notice from the city to enforce the seizure. I'll call an inspector to verify your ventilation airflow. Once we have the paperwork proving the system is to code, the clause is completely void. An expedited commercial inspection costs $1,000, she said over her shoulder. She set the heat gun down and began stretching the now pliable leather smoothly over the foam bolster. Her movements were graceful again, the fabric yielding perfectly to her pull. I don't have the cash for that, Bentley. Casson owes me a massive favor. I lied easily. Casson Baker was my dedicated parts supplier. He delivered my rare engine blocks. And he didn't owe me a damn thing. But my family's holding company owned the firm that certified commercial inspections in this district? I could have an inspector here by tomorrow without opening my wallet? I fixed his transmission last month for free. He has a guy at the city planning office. I'll make the call. Harper stopped working. She turned off the heat gun. The sudden silence in the bay felt incredibly heavy. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Her voice dropped, filled with the deep-seated suspicion of someone entirely used to conditional kindness. People didn't just offer $1,000 favors without wanting leverage in return. Because if Vincent successfully kicks you out, he'll bring in a 24-hour logistics hub, I answered, keeping my tone entirely casual. I looked at the concrete floor, tracing a grease stain with my boot to sell the deflection. And backing up delivery trucks with those reverse alarms are significantly louder than your sewing machine. I like the quiet. It helps me focus on the engine timing. She stared at me for a long moment. She didn't entirely buy the excuse, but she didn't have the energy to fight the lifeline. "I'll pay Kaysen back," she insisted, her pride demanding a stake in the transaction. "In installments?" "I'll tell him," I said. I turned and walked back to my bay before she could argue further. For the next 3 days, the warehouse became a quiet exercise in proximity and endurance. I stayed under the hood of the Mustang, carefully replacing the timing belt, gapping the spark plugs, and cleaning the fuel injectors with a solvent that smelled sharp and clean. Harper stayed at her sewing table, working through a massive backlog of custom orders. I made the call to the inspection firm on Wednesday morning. I didn't ask for a favor. I bypassed the standard public queue by using an internal corporate routing number I hadn't dialed in 4 years, scheduling the priority audit for Friday afternoon. I watched Harper work. She was relentless. She refused to stop for lunch, running her body entirely on black coffee from a cheap plastic maker and sheer willpower. On Thursday evening, a heavy coastal storm rolled into the city. Rain battered the metal roof. The temperature inside the uninsulated industrial warehouse plummeted rapidly, the cold seeping through the corrugated metal walls and settling onto the concrete floor. I was standing at my workbench, using a fine wire brush to scrub carbon buildup off an aluminum valve cover, when I noticed Harper rubbing her hands together vigorously. Her bay was positioned directly next to the large, drafty, rolling loading doors. The bitter cold was making her fingers stiff, slowing down her precise stitching on a delicate piece of gray Alcantara. She wouldn't complain. She would just freeze and work through the physical pain until her joints locked up. I set down my wire brush. The metal clinked loudly against the bench. I walked to the back storage area of my bay and pulled out a heavy, oscillating industrial infrared heater. It was a high-end unit meant for curing automotive paint, but on a low setting, it threw a massive amount of ambient, radiant heat. I carried the heavy orange unit around the chain-link fence and into her bay, unspooling the thick extension cord behind me. I didn't ask if she was cold. I walked over and set the heater down exactly 5 feet to the left of her sewing station. I carefully angled the ceramic coils so the heat would sweep across her immediate workspace without directly hitting the sensitive glues or melting the synthetic backings of her fabrics. I plugged it in and hit the heavy toggle switch. The coils instantly glowed a bright, aggressive orange. The smell of settled dust burning off the ceramic elements briefly filled the air before a powerful wave of warm air pushed into the freezing bay. Harper stopped the motorized foot pedal of her sewing machine. She looked at the glowing heater, then up at me. "My hands were locking up," she admitted quietly. The admission clearly cost her a significant amount of pride. "Alcantara is harder to work when the ambient temperature drops," I said. I kept the focus entirely on the physical material, purposely deflecting the act of personal care into professional logic. I didn't want her to feel like she owed me for the warmth. I walked over to the small, stained coffee maker on her metal desk. The glass pot was entirely empty, a dark ring of burned sludge baked into the bottom. I unplugged it, picked it up, and walked back to my bay. I had a premium, commercial-grade espresso machine hidden in my small, enclosed office area, a minor luxury I allowed myself from the old life. I ground a fresh batch of beans, tamped the portafilter, and brewed a dark, rich pot of Americano. I poured it into a heavy ceramic mug and carried it back to her desk. I didn't hand the mug to her directly. That would require her to stop working, take the cup, and acknowledge the gesture. I set it down on the cleared corner of her desk, ensuring the steam wafted directly over her workspace, carrying the scent of roasted espresso. "Drink the water too," I instructed softly, tapping a sealed bottle of water sitting untouched near her heavy fabric shears. "Then, finish the seam." I turned and walked back to the Mustang. I didn't wait for a thank you. I just picked up my wire brush and went back to the carbon buildup. On Friday, the tension in the warehouse was sharp enough to fracture glass. The inspector arrived precisely at noon. He was a strict, humorless official wearing a high-visibility vest, carrying an electronic anemometer and a digital clipboard. He spent a grueling hour measuring the cubic airflow, checking the exhaust outputs on the roof, and swabbing the chemical residue in the micron filters of Harper's overhead ventilation system. Harper stood perfectly still by her desk the entire time. Her arms were crossed so tight against her chest I thought she might bruise her own ribs. She watched his every move with barely concealed dread. I stood in my bay, wiping grease off my hands with a fresh blue shop towel, listening to the interaction through the wire fence. Carson Baker, my parts supplier, had just dropped off a heavy crate of alternators. He stood near my lift, silently watching the inspection. Carson knew Vincent's tactics. He'd seen independent shops gutted before. The inspector finally lowered his digital meter. He pressed a button to lock the reading, the device beeping sharply, then walked over to Harper. "The extracting system is operating at 94% efficiency, Miss Jones," the inspector announced, his voice echoing in the quiet warehouse. "It is well within the required municipal safety codes for commercial upholstery and adhesive application. I detect no hazardous fume violations." Harper exhaled. It was a ragged, shuddering breath that seemed to unlock her entire posture. Her shoulders dropped 2 inches. "So, the eviction is void. I will file the official report with the city," the inspector said. He pulled a printed receipt from a portable thermal printer attached to his belt and handed it to her. "It is officially time-stamped. The landlord has no legal grounds for an environmental breach." He packed his equipment and walked out the heavy bay doors. Cason Baker wiped his boots on the mat, gave Harper a single, solid nod of respect, and headed back to his delivery truck. Harper leaned back against the edge of her desk. The crushing weight of the last 4 days lifted off her shoulders. She looked across the chain-link partition at me. A small, exhausted smile finally broke through her defenses. "He passed it," she said. "I told you," I replied easily, leaning against the fender of the Mustang. "It was just a matter of getting the right meter in here to prove the system works." The victory was profound. It lasted exactly 6 hours. At 6 o'clock, the heavy rolling doors at the front of the complex rattled loudly on their tracks. The lighting in the warehouse had shifted. The afternoon sun replaced by the harsh, clinical glare of the overhead sodium lamps. Vincent Perez walked into the building. He didn't look like a commercial landlord doing a standard property check. He wore a charcoal, bespoke, tailored suit, his leather Oxfords clicking sharply against the concrete floor. He carried a sleek, black leather folio. He walked straight past the front bays, ignoring the other mechanics, and stopped directly at the chain-link boundary of Bay 4. I was at my workbench tightening a brass fuel fitting. I stopped moving. I didn't turn around immediately, but my focus locked entirely on the sound of Vincent's voice. "Harper," Vincent said, his tone entirely too smooth, carrying the oily confidence of an auditor holding a loaded deck. Harper stopped her sewing machine. She stood up, her spine stiffening defensively. "Vincent, you received the inspector's report from the city." "I did," Vincent confirmed, opening the black folio. "Your extraction system is fully compliant. Section 4B regarding hazardous materials is, as of this afternoon, officially void. I cannot evict you for environmental violations." "Then we have nothing else to discuss," Harper said, reaching for her heavy fabric shears to signal the conversation was over. "Unfortunately, we do," Vincent countered. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the folio, stepped into her bay, and set the paper face up on her cutting table. "When I initiated the structural audit, my accounting algorithm ran a mandatory secondary review of your entire commercial file. We reviewed your payment history for the last 24 months. Harper frowned, looking down at the paper. "My balance is current. I paid this month's rent on the 1st. "You did," Vincent agreed calmly. "But you were 4 days late on your rent last November. You were 2 days late in February. And the wire transfer for May cleared the bank 3 days after the grace period. I paid the standard late penalties for those months," she argued, her voice rising slightly as the trap began to close around her. "And the May delay was a verified banking error on a weekend holiday. I sent your office the documentation. The money arrived late," Vincent said, completely dismissing the context. "Section Sept. Paragraph C of the master commercial lease explicitly states that 3 instances of delayed payment within a consecutive 12-month period constitutes a definitive breach of the financial reliability covenant. You cashed the checks? Harper said, her hands gripping the edge of the table. You accepted the late fees? Accepting a late fee does not waive my right to enforce the reliability covenant, Vincent stated, citing the corporate legalese with practiced ease. The previous eviction notice stands, amended for financial breach. The terms are non-negotiable. You have until next Friday at 5 p.m. to vacate the bay. If your equipment remains on the premises after that hour, it will be seized to cover the breach penalties and the cost of breaking the lease. He closed his folio with a sharp snap. Next Friday, Harper. Do not leave a mess for my new tenant. He turned and walked out of the warehouse, the heavy doors slamming shut behind him. The silence in Bay 4 was absolute, crushing. Harper stared at the white sheet of paper on her cutting table. The fight drained out of her entirely. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to. It was designed to crush the independent operator, using buried technicalities to clear the floor for massive corporate capital. She turned around slowly. She walked to the corner of her bay, pulled a stack of flattened cardboard boxes from a storage rack, and dropped them onto the concrete floor. I put down my wrench. The quiet, understated mechanic routine was over. I couldn't fix a financial covenant breach with an extension cord. Vincent was playing a high-stakes game of leverage, and he had targeted the one asset Harper couldn't physically defend, her lack of capital. I wiped the grease off my hands with a heavy citrus solvent, drying them completely on a clean towel. I walked around the partition. I didn't stop until I was standing inside her bay. I didn't reach out to touch her. I stood 3 feet away, giving her the space to process the shock, but placing myself directly in her line of sight. Stop packing, I said. My voice lost its casual deflection. It was low and firm. Harper grabbed a roll of heavy packing tape. The dispenser shrieked as she pulled the plastic strip hard. I have to box the specialized dies first. If he seizes those, I can't even take freelance piecework from my apartment. You aren't losing the bay, Harper, I stated. He has the master lease, Bentley, she said, her voice finally cracking under the pressure. I don't have the credit score to hire a commercial litigator, and I don't have $10,000 to move. The game is over. Contracts are just paper, I said smoothly, falling back into a language I hadn't spoken in years. Leave Vincent Perez to me. What are you going to do? She asked, gesturing to my grease-stained apron. Hit a commercial real estate developer with a torque wrench? I build engines because I choose to, I replied softly, holding her gaze. I know how to dismantle a structural liability. Just leave the boxes alone. I walked back to my bay, straight into my small, enclosed office area, and shut the heavy door. I opened the bottom drawer of my metal filing cabinet. Underneath a stack of faded service manuals, there was a small, encrypted black smartphone. My thumb hovered over the contact list. I hadn't dialed the primary asset manager for Young Holdings in 4 years. The screen lit up my grease-stained knuckles. I pressed call anyway. Bentley, the voice on the other end said, sounding surprised. We haven't heard from you since the Q2 board meeting. I need an immediate financial teardown on a mid-tier commercial developer operating in the Port District, I said, my voice dropping into the cold, authoritative cadence I was raised to use. Name is Vincent Perez. I want to know who holds his mezzanine debt, what his liquidity covenants are, and exactly how over-leveraged he is. Give me 10 minutes, the asset manager replied smoothly. What are we looking for? A structural weakness, I said, looking through the glass window of my office at Harper, who was staring blankly at the half-taped cardboard box. By morning, I want the lender's notice of default drafted and filed. I want his management contract suspended pending a full audit, freeze his leverage. The next morning, the warehouse felt completely different. The air was cold. The heaters turned off. Harper arrived at 7, unlocking the heavy bay doors with a jarring metallic screech. She didn't turn on her sewing machine. She walked straight to the stack of flattened cardboard boxes and began taping them together. I stepped out of my office. I wore a clean pair of dark denim jeans and a simple black long-sleeve Henley. I held a single, thick manila folder in my left hand. I walked directly into Bay 4 and stopped a few feet away from her cutting table. I told you to leave the boxes alone, Harper, I said quietly. I have until 5 o'clock today, Bentley, she said, her voice flat. If I don't have the primary sewing machines out of here, Vincent will lock the bay doors. Vincent Perez isn't seizing anything, I stated, dropping the manila folder onto her cutting table. It landed with a heavy, solid thud. His management contract is officially suspended. Before she could process the information, the main warehouse doors rolled open. A luxury black SUV pulled directly onto the concrete floor of the complex. Vincent Perez stepped out. He walked toward Bay 4, stopping when he saw me standing inside Harper's workspace. "I see you're packing, Harper," Vincent said loudly. "Excellent. It will save my extraction crew the billable hours when the deadline hits at 5. I turned slowly to face him. "She isn't packing. And your extraction crew isn't crossing the threshold of this building." Vincent's smirk twisted into a sneer. "The mechanic thinks he has a say in commercial real estate law? This bay is in financial default." "This bay is completely current," I stated, stepping toward him. I didn't stop until I was standing directly in his personal space. "But your management firm is in massive, terminal, default?" I picked up the manila folder from Harper's desk. I pulled out a heavy, watermarked legal document and held it out. "Read it," I commanded. Vincent snatched the paper. The sneer vanished instantly. The color drained from his face as he registered the letterhead. "Young Holdings," Vincent whispered. He looked up at me, his mind racing to connect the mechanic to the corporate entity. "You're Arthur Young's son. I am the primary shareholder of the firm that just bought your mezzanine debt from First Capital," I clarified coldly. "You missed your required liquidity threshold at 9 o'clock this morning. By morning, the lender's notice of default was filed with the city. I am terminating your operational management contract for predatory practices pending a full audit. You have 30 days to vacate the management office." Vincent looked at me, realizing the absolute finality of the situation. Carson Baker, standing by the loading dock with a clipboard, didn't smirk. He nodded once because he'd seen Vincent do this to 3 other shops, and he knew exactly what justice looked like. Vincent crumpled the legal document in his fist, turned on his heel, and walked rapidly back to his SUV. The heavy bay doors closed. The warehouse was completely silent. Harper stood by the stack of boxes. She looked at the tape dispenser in her hand, then set it down slowly on the table. "You're a Young," she said, the name sounding sharp in the gritty industrial bay. "My family controls the board," I corrected quietly, stepping back to give her space. "I fix cars." "You bought his debt to stop an eviction?" she stated, her voice tight, a defense mechanism snapping into place. "You let me think you were just a mechanic." "I am a mechanic, Harper," I said, pointing to the classic Mustang sitting in Bay 7. "That money. It isn't who I am. I hide in this warehouse because I want to work with my actual hands. I don't need charity, Bentley," she said, her fierce independence flaring up. "It isn't charity," I argued, my voice firm. "Vincent was stealing your business using a rigged system. I used the exact same system to stop him. The tools are different, but the outcome is simply leveling the floor." I reached into the manila folder and pulled out a second document. I set it down on her desk, directly next to the empty ceramic mug. "This is a new commercial lease," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional. "It grants you full operational control of Bay 4 for the next 10 years. There are no hazardous material clauses, and the late fee traps have been entirely deleted." Harper looked down at the crisp white pages of the contract. Her hands trembled slightly. "Sign it or don't," I said smoothly, taking another step back to ensure she felt absolutely no physical or emotional pressure. "The lease stands either way. This isn't about me, it's about stopping predatory clauses." She stared at the paper. For a moment, the unworthiness complex fought the reality on the desk. Then, she didn't retreat. She pushed the stack of flattened cardboard boxes back under the cutting table herself. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. I looked at her. I looked at the faint traces of dye on her overalls and the fierce pride that kept her standing. "I'm glad," I admitted, my voice dropping into a low, honest resonance. "Because watching you work is the only thing in this building that makes any sense to me." She stared at me, the thick, guarded distance finally fracturing. She reached out, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the new contract. "I'm not easy to love at all," she warned me, the vulnerability slipping out. I didn't step back. I reached into the front pocket of my jeans and pulled out a heavy, brass master key to the warehouse complex. I set it directly on top of the lease. "Nothing worth having is ever easy," I answered softly. Harper picked up a heavy black pen from her desk organizer. She signed her name on the bottom line of the lease with a sharp, definitive motion. She slid the pen back across the desk toward me. "Don't touch my seams with those mechanic hands," she said, a faint, dry wit finally breaking through the exhaustion. The Mustang in Bay 7 still smelled heavily of unburned fuel and old metal, but for the first time in 4 years, the air in the warehouse didn't feel like a countdown. I learned that the right person doesn't add chaos, they bring warmth, hold the line, and show up again tomorrow. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.